So recording is starting, which means that it's now time to introduce, well, Kate hardly needs any introduction, but I would like to say really that, yes, you can, could I now ask everyone to mute themselves, please? I'll mute you, Jenny. I see that you're struggling. Kate has been a very good friend to the Peace Group. She is also clearly the face of CND, having been the General Secretary for more than 10 years now. So the rest of the introduction about Kate, you can do your own introduction from now on, Kate, and we'll do a similar format to the one that we used last time with Rob, in the sense that Kate will talk for a chunk of time, let's say 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have questions, and then she'll talk for a second chunk of time, and again questions. So it'll be two shorter bursts rather than one long burst, slightly easier to digest. And talking about digesting, you might see her tucking into her supper at the same time while talking.
No, that's afterwards.
Oh, is it? Oh, all right, okay.
It's being made downstairs at the moment. I can hear the pans.
Okay, right. I'm going to mute myself. Kate, and by the way, obviously you do have a choice of either having her in the centre, or if you prefer gallery view, then you can control that. For most of you, it's top right that you would be choosing between your gallery view or the speaker view. Kate, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for inviting me. Lovely to see you all. I'm hoping that maybe next year we'll be seeing each other in your lovely meeting house once again. But in the meantime, this is good. I'm going to split my opening remarks into two sessions, as you've just heard from the chair. The first one, I'm going to talk about the TPNW itself, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I'm going to talk a little bit about the background, how it came about, the opposition to it, and so on. Then we'll have the little break for discussion. And then I'm going to come back and talk about what we can do practically in campaigning terms and some of the initiatives that are taking place and so on. So I hope that suits everybody. Well, what fantastic news it was last year when we discovered that the TPNW had enough ratifications. The Nuclear Ban Treaty, as it's usually called or popularly called in the movement, was on track to become international law. And it gave rise to a real wave of enthusiasm amongst our members and supporters. I thought maybe people wouldn't be that excited, because Britain says it won't sign up, or people might think, oh, it's a treaty. But actually, the kind of enthusiasm has been enormous. So that's really great. One of the things that struck me is what a long time it's been in coming, 7 decades or whatever it is now since the first bomb was used. And I thought back about the different stages and the different times this kind of demand has come to the fore. And I realized that, in fact, at the UN's founding conference, the whole question of getting rid of nuclear weapons was a big factor at that time, and there was a very strong drive within the UN to abolish nuclear weapons, and then there were various plans to put them under international control and all kinds of things like that, which didn't really come off. Then I suppose the first really big stage on the road to the TPNW was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which came into force in 1970. And that, of course, was driven by the non-nuclear weapon states wanting to bring about a treaty which would ensure the disarmament by the nuclear weapon states. So that was the kind of dynamic then. And of course, as we're aware, unfortunately, that the NPT has kind of hit a brick wall with the 9 nuclear weapon states 5 of them recognised under the NPT, you know, not really wanting to make any progress. So it's kind of stalled, so to speak. Then many of us will remember from the mid-1990s, there were calls for a nuclear weapons convention. This was the terminology we used to use until the Global Ban Treaty became kind of popular parlance. That was that states would sign up to a convention to abolish nuclear weapons, much like the chemical and biological weapons conventions and so on. But no progress really happened on that either. I think every year at the UN General Assembly, it was kind of reasserted as a goal, but there was no progress. But that's not to say that things weren't happening, taking us in the direction of the nuclear ban. And I think the developments which are most significant for me was the drive largely from the global south for self-organization of nuclear weapons-free zones. So we've had a situation for a couple of decades now that most of, well, I think pretty much all the global south is self-organized into nuclear weapons-free zones, and patchy parts of the Northern Hemisphere, particularly in Central Asia, Mongolia, and so on. So it's like countries that were fed up with the failure of the NPT to deliver nuclear disarmament were taking it into their own hands and forming these nuclear weapons-free zone treaties off their own bat. And I think to a great extent that has been the inspiration really for the nuclear ban treaty, because many of the countries that have been leading the way on the ban treaty are also countries from the global south that are already in nuclear weapons-free zones. So it's kind of reinforcing and kind of really trying to push it forward. In terms of when the wider world began to know about it, so to speak, I think that President Obama put the issue back on the global agenda. I think it was in 2009, was it, when he made his so-called Prague speech calling for nuclear disarmament, and he got a Nobel Peace Prize as a result of that. Unfortunately, he wasn't really able to advance it at all, but it certainly put that back on the agenda as a global demand. And then in 2010, at the NPT review conference, at the end of the conference, the states parties came out with a statement saying they had deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons. And it was that really which started the very specific process that led to the nuclear ban treaty that has come into force earlier this year. So following that specific reference to humanitarian consequences, a series of international conferences was set up. And one of the things about these conferences was that it wasn't just states and governments who wanted to have nuclear abolition that were kind of pushing it forward. They were also consciously and intentionally working very closely with civil society organizations. So from the start, it was a kind of partnership between the two kind of wings, so to speak, of nuclear disarmament support. I think the most prominent civil society organization was the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. Obviously, they have huge international standing and very kind of broad support and so on. So they were able to win a lot of people over and change people's minds, because they pointed out that, in the event of nuclear war, the idea that health services can look after survivors is just a completely bonkers idea. The people who are supposed to do the kind of looking after will also be dead. So the whole thing about the scale, the extent of the catastrophe that would unfold, began to be understood more widely. And scientists also, and environmentalists produced extensive new research about the impact of even a small global exchange on the climate. So it would make the temperature drop sufficiently that huge swathes of the world would be unable to produce food. The whole grain growing belt would be unable to produce food. So there'd be mass starvation, on a global scale. I mean, they've done, very rigorous scientific studies and projections on this. So all this kind of thing led to a kind of increasing groundswell of opinion that actually this is something that states and responsible governments could not tolerate, the idea that such a thing could happen. So these conferences continued over a number of years, and eventually a text was negotiated and adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2017, and it was open for signature. So gradually the signatures started to trickle in, sometimes little bursts and so on. And 3 years later, the requisite 50 ratifications were gathered. So in the case of this treaty, it requires 50 ratifications by states, and then a 90-day period to elapse before the treaty actually comes into force. So last October, there were huge celebrations. The 50th ratification had come in and so on. What was interesting was how in the period just before the 50th ratification, how the nuclear weapons states had this flurry of activity to try and prevent the sufficient ratifications happening. So, for example, not only had the US and UK ambassadors to the UN sort of very strenuously opposed it as it was being negotiated, and apparently at one negotiating conference they'd stood outside the hall doors, kind of, trying to prevail upon people not to go in and kind of insulting them and all this sort of stuff. Not only had they done that, but it was reported by the Associated Press Agency that they'd got hold of a letter signed by the 5 original nuclear weapons states, US, Russia, China, Britain and France, saying that they stand unified in our opposition to the potential repercussions of the treaty. And they were sending this round to NATO states and to any other states that they felt that they could influence. Anyway, much to the credit of all these countries that signed and ratified, many of whom are small and poor countries, you might feel might be intimidated, but no, they stood up and they signed and ratified the treaty. So it was ratified, and then there were the kind of 90-day period. So one of the things that this letter that was going around from the nuclear weapons states focused on is something that we've also heard from our own governments. I'm sure some of you have written to your MPs or written to the Foreign Secretary or something saying, we need to sign up to the TPNW. And very often the response that we get back is, no, we can't do that. We support the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and the TPNW is a threat to the NPT, and it will sort of destroy attempts to have a kind of non-proliferation regime going on globally. So this is a kind of crazy argument that's put forward by the nuclear weapons states. And of course, it's completely untrue. And I heard a very interesting, I think it was a CND webinar in January, where we had a couple of legal experts from the States, talking about the status of the TPNW and all that kind of thing. And they said that actually they are complementary treaties and in no way in conflict with each other, because the NPT calls for complete disarmament of nuclear weapons. It doesn't include a practical plan to make that happen. So the TPNW brings forth the practical plan to make that happen. And they are in kind of well, synergistic with each other. So that's a kind of one of the key arguments we have to face down with the government and people who support the government in Parliament and so on. So funnily enough, it's strange that they're so dismissive about the TPNW, but at the same time, they're obviously very rattled by it. You know, they think it's kind of irrelevant and they'll never sign, so therefore, so what? Why are they trying to stop people signing up to it and supporting it? I suspect it's because it will act as a restraint on them in a number of ways, not least in terms of investment. And we are aware there's a recent Christian CND and faith communities report, which indicated that disinvestment or divestment is going on with a number of pensions funds and big investment funds and so on, where they are invested in nuclear weapons companies. So there's a kind of pulling out taking place. So those kinds of impacts will be ongoing. So just to say very quickly then, a little bit about the treaty itself. I'm sure you're all aware it's a comprehensive ban on nuclear weapons and related activity. It prohibits the use, stockpiling, testing, production, manufacture, stationing and installation of nuclear weapons. So pretty much, well, everything to do with nuclear weapons. And so this is the way in which it is very, very significant. So for the first time, legislation exists which rules the very existence of nuclear weapons to be illegal. Some of you will remember there was a previous international legal opinion which came from the World Court in 1996, which said that under virtually all circumstances it would be illegal to use them, but it never said it would be illegal to possess them or manufacture them. So this is really an enormous step forward. One of the most remarkable things about the treaty, which I find very moving, I think, is that it places obligations on signatory states to assist victims of nuclear weapons use and testing. And that's amazing, really. And it also requires environmental remediation for lands contaminated by nuclear testing. So it addresses this whole problem. Of course, as we know, there were hundreds of atmospheric nuclear tests before the partial test ban treaty in the early 60s, and then, of course, thousands of underground tests subsequently. It also explicitly recognises the disproportionate impact of nuclear weapon activities on indigenous peoples because of the choices made by nuclear powers for their testing sites. So, for example, many of the UK tests were conducted on the Australian First Peoples territories in Emu Field and Maralinga, contaminating large parts of South Australia. France, as you may know, tested nuclear weapons in Algeria, and there's a long list of humanitarian catastrophes internationally as a result of testing. So it's a very strong strand within the treaty that these historic wrongs must be righted. So I'm just going to finish this section by saying a little bit about public opinion. You may know of this if our press officer has been doing their job. You'll have heard about this. Our government is rejecting the TPNW, boycotted the vote and so on, says Britain will never sign up. But a national poll, which CND carried out in January, showed that 77% of the population supports a total ban on all nuclear weapons globally. And that includes 71% of Conservative voters and 83% of Labour voters. And then almost 60% of the public support the government signing up to the treaty. And that includes 50% of Conservative voters and 68% of Labour voters. So when you heard, what's his name, Healey, John Healey, the Labour shadow defence person last week saying, oh, it's Labour support for Trident is non-negotiable and all that. Well, they should listen to their voters. You know, if 83% of Labour voters think we should have global abolition of nuclear weapons, you know, who are they trying to impress by saying that Labour will always support Trident? So, in other words, great public opinion on our side and fruitful terrain for taking it forward, which we'll discuss in the second part. Thanks, Chair. I think I went on a bit long there, but sorry about that.
No, not at all. Thank you. So we're going to have our first session for questions. Dave, you've already typed a question into the chat. So Kate, you'll be able to see that from the chat. If I could ask the rest of you, if you want to ask a question, either stick your hand up or use the reactions little button bottom of your screen so you can stick your hand up in that way. But Dave, your question, go ahead, ask it yourself. Dave, you're on mute still.
Yes, I just wondered when you were talking about the nuclear states and how they were trying to pressure other countries not to sign. Was any indication that any economic pressure was exerted on them in terms of you know, we're not going to do this deal with you if you sign up to this treaty, that kind of thing? I'm thinking in the era of Trump, really, but it could apply to any of the others as well.
Yes, I mean, I would tend to think so. There are just two examples, specific examples that I'm aware of pressure actually being put. One was by the US on Sweden, which was involved in the negotiations early on, and I think was minded to support it. And of course, Sweden had been involved in the development of the NPT originally. It's got quite a strong track record on this, so they were kind of silenced effectively. And the other example where I believe that there was a financial thing was in the case of the Marshall Islands. And of course, the Marshall Islands is where some of the tests took place, and you may remember their Prime Minister or Foreign Minister, I think Tony de Brum, who made an appearance at the NPT review conference in New York. I don't remember when exactly, whether it was 2010 or 2015, you know, but a very powerful advocate for support for the victims of nuclear weapons testing. But apparently, I've asked a colleague recently, why hadn't they signed up to the TPNW? And I was informed that it's because they were or are recipients of some kind of financial settlement because of their islands being used as test centres. And if they were to sign up, then they would not any longer receive that kind of financial support, you know, which is, you know, absolutely disgraceful. But I'm sure that threats have been used on other countries, and I know that certainly NATO states that have been interested, and I think perhaps the Netherlands had earlier on been involved in negotiations. They've all been pressured out of that.
Kate, do you know whether Biden has reacted yet to the TPNW?
I haven't heard his position on it, but I have heard, I mean, there's a bit of debate going on about this in the US at the moment, that he has said he is opposed to a first use policy. And of course, if the US were to abandon a first use policy, in other words, they would use nuclear weapons first, that would be extremely significant, you know, because some of the other nuclear weapons states do have no first use policies. China does, I think India does, not sure about the others. think Russia has sometimes, but if the US were to kind of take that one step down, that would have a significant effect. So we await to see what's going to happen with that. And of course, there are other indications that Biden doesn't really want to kind of continue the escalatory path which President Trump had followed with his usable nukes production and deployment and those kinds of policies. Biden doesn't seem to be on that track at all. It's good news that he and President Putin have extended the New START treaty, an arms limitations and reductions treaty. So that's very positive. So we hope that. So we hope that he'll go on that track. I don't know if you saw that apparently there was a Panorama program, which was it? No, it was Newsnight, which I missed, but it had a report on the fact that the UK Foreign Office has been putting pressure on the US Congress to spend more money and rapidly produce a kind of new warhead. New nuclear warhead, because Britain wants it for the Trident replacement, but the US Congress isn't very keen on going ahead with it because theirs can last for, another decade or so. So it was a bizarre situation where Britain is pressing the US to spend more money on a new nuclear warhead. You couldn't make it up really. But so obviously that's a very bad development. But I think there are, apart from the fact that Biden's dragging his heels seemingly on going back into the Iran nuclear deal, there are some positive indications that he's not, at least not going to be escalatory on the nuclear front.
Thank you. Do we have questions from anyone else? Go ahead.
Is CND's policy that NATO should unilaterally dispose of all nuclear weapons and allow the likes of Putin and Xi to have nuclear weapons?
No, we're for global abolition of nuclear weapons. We want to see all nuclear weapons eradicated. It is the case that we would like to see Britain disarm first. So we've always had this position of both unilateralism and multilateralism. So we want Britain to disarm and comply with its NPT agreements and commitments, but at the same time we recognise, Britain has a relatively small arsenal, and if we're going to deal with the problem, we have to deal with it on a global level. Hence our very strong support for the NPT and our support for the TPNW. And we do, obviously not at the moment because of the pandemic, but we've conducted quite a lot of diplomatic lobbying, where we've equally lobbied all nuclear weapons states. It's not something we just restrict to our own government. We lobby all nuclear weapons states with the goal of nuclear disarmament globally.
But soon as it's 75 years that the government after the Second World War made the ridiculous decision to develop our own nuclear weapon, we look like there's another 75 years ahead of us before anything really will happen, because we've got an amazingly strong power now in China, which is only really recently developing nuclear weapons, and now it's developing in space. So it's going to be a very long time before universal abandonment of nuclear weapons is going to happen.
Well, let's hope that one of the impacts of the pandemic will be that countries will orientate away from so much military expenditure towards dealing with other threats, like pandemic threats, which are going to continue, things like dealing with climate change, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare, all these different kinds of threats that the world is facing. And largely, particularly with things like climate change, which is an existential threat, those are things that you need global cooperation on. So I think certainly any steps by us or our allies to kind of increase tensions between countries, I mean, that's certainly not the way to go. And with regard to China specifically, which you've mentioned, China has an arsenal, a nuclear arsenal about the size of the French nuclear arsenal, you know, and I very much hope that they don't go down the road of expanding their nuclear arsenal. You know, that would be absolutely the wrong thing to do. And so far during their massive economic development, they've chosen not to kind of disproportionately develop their nuclear arsenal. You know, so let's hope that they stick with that and don't feel that they're kind of pushed into a corner. I mean, for example, Britain is sending its new aircraft carrier to the South China Sea, starting off in May. You know, is that a good idea? It seems to me that not only is it going to be very expensive, I wonder why Britain has to be doing that and sending other ships and aircraft and fighter jets and so on into a place a very long way away, which is a very sensitive area, you know. So I think what we need now is leaders of states, you know, and governmental leaders trying to make some wise de-escalatory decisions. You know, we no longer have Trump with his erratic behavior. You know, let's try and now prevail on world leaders to take a more sensible approach to dealing with complex problems or dealing with tensions between states.
I'm very much on your side, but people have this faith in Biden, which I have none, and the strength of the Western leadership at the moment is so weak. And Xi is not the same person as Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping showed moderation. Xi is exactly the reverse, and that's quite frightening. The way he is a domineering leader. So I'm very much on your side. I wish you all the best. But my experience or my reading of history of human nature is not on your side.
Well, I'm ever the optimist, Bruce, and I do feel that, you know, if you have I think that public demand, you know, and mobilization can make a difference, you know. And I think that, I mean, on the question of Biden, yes, he's very much from the US establishment, and he's supported plenty of wars, and he's committed to all those things. But also, in order to win the presidency, you know, he was supported. He knows that he was supported by more left-wing people in his party. You know, those fantastic young women. And he was supported by civil society and the social movements, you know, because they wanted something new and different from Trump, you know. So hopefully he'll realize he can't just go back to war and business as usual. You know, he has to be shaped to some extent by the demands of people, you know, for a better life in the post-pandemic world.
I'll adopt some of your optimism.
Right.
Any other questions for Kate? Nigel, you're on mute.
Yeah, I'll come down. Thank you, Kate. I wonder if you could just comment on some things that are on our side. So, for example, the linking with the environmental movement, such as with XR Peace, and I think many groups are linking with their environmental groups like XR. So that is seems to me to be good. And for example, Oxford City Council supported the TPNW. That was last January. So many councils are working towards that and have done it. And also, for example, our MP, she's in the shadow cabinet and sent a letter recently to me about how supportive she is of TPNW and multilateral talks. So things like that are on our side, I think. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Well, Can I answer that in my next section? Because
Sure.
if I answer that now, I won't have anything left to say.
Okay.
But you're
Thank you.
absolutely right. That's the crucial thing.
Thank you very much.
Kate, do you want to take
Yeah.
a minute or two break for people to just stretch their legs and fill up their tea cups? Or do you want to go
If
straight
you
in?
want to do
Yeah?
that, yeah, that's fine by me.
Okay, all right. Well, see you in 2 minutes, everyone.
See you in 2 minutes. Go ahead.
Yes, please. Go for it.
Okay, thanks. So I'll keep this second part a bit shorter. Curb my enthusiasm. So going back to the poll results then, I mean, that real burst of, the real strength of support for global abolition, for the treaty, is not widely reported on, as you may have noticed, particularly in the kind of in the national press. And I remember autumn of last year when we were trying to get coverage of the fact that we had the 50 ratifications. The press officer got in touch with The Guardian, and The Guardian said, "Oh no, we covered that a couple of years ago. We're not going to cover that again." So it's, I mean, just makes you tear your hair out. Anyway, but nevertheless, it's very well supported, that position, and it's also very well articulated. If you can actually get to hear the arguments, it's fantastic. And particularly many faith leaders are really strong on this, really clear. I think the Pope's been great, and Bruce Curtis often telling me how good the Pope is on these various things, but other people as well. I think the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, who used to be Bishop of Reading, I think it was, we called him Bishop of Aldermaston. He's very strongly supportive, and many other faith leaders of many different faith communities. It's not only the Christian community. Many trade union leaders are really good and on side. There's a couple who aren't, but it's a really strong thing across civil society. So how are we going to change the government's mind? Well, there are a number of ways in which we feel we can advance the fortunes of the treaty here in Britain. So first of all, parliamentary lobbying. So obviously you can't go and see your MP in person, but we've been having a virtual lobby now for some time. So we're calling on all our supporters to arrange a meeting with their MPs. We've had quite a number of favourable remarks from MPs that we weren't necessarily expecting, so that's very positive. One of the focuses for this is asking them to support EDM 1072. This was put down in the autumn of last year. 66 MPs have signed it so far, not millions, but it's a solid base of support in Parliament. And the EDM was put down by a cross-party group of MPs, so pretty much everything except the Tories. So it's got good broad support across Parliament. We also have a petition calling on the government to get rid of its nukes and support the treaty, and that will be presented to Downing Street at a point later in the year when it's possible to actually do that. So those are kind of, I guess they're fairly standard things which we do. But I think that the most important development, which Nigel touched on earlier on, is the whole initiative, what we call the Nuclear Ban Communities Initiative, which is it's actually a global phenomenon, and it's supported by the ICANN Cities Appeal as well. So basically around the world, particularly in countries which haven't signed up to the treaty, you have cities, towns, local authorities, some places in Britain, parish councils, have signed up to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. I think Nigel mentioned Oxford, has recently signed up. And in a number of places, they coincide it with becoming, if it's a mayor doing it, becoming a mayor for peace, which is the Japanese-led initiative by the mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it's kind of way of bypassing national opposition to assert the strength of local democracy, local and regional democracy. So you've got Washington, for example, Paris, Manchester, Edinburgh, of course, capital of Scotland, and many, many other places are becoming nuclear ban communities and supporting the TPNW. And we're getting more and more of these across Britain. One of my favourite is the Newham Borough Council and directly elected mayor, Roxana Fias, the first woman Muslim mayor. She's in Newham in East London, and it's particularly great because Newham, of course, is the local borough in which the Excel Centre is located, where the DESI Arms Fair is held every couple of years. So she's now a mayor for peace, strongly opposed to the arms fair. So let's hope, as well as being on side with the anti-nuclear stuff, she'll be able to actually prevent the arms fair taking place next year, or is it this year, or whenever. So, there are all kinds of incredible possibilities with the nuclear ban communities work. I don't know if Nigel's obviously been engaged in that locally, but I don't know what kind of council Faringdon has. Maybe they're already on side, maybe you're working on them, but there are all kinds of opportunities to contact local councillors, for example. We've got a draft motion on our website, which people can put to their local authorities. So that's really positive. It's a great way of raising awareness as well locally. It's a good opportunity for local media work too. There's a lot of great letters and articles we get sent from local newspapers and so on as a response to the TPNW and all kinds of other nuclear related matters as well. So it's a way of getting a good profile for the treaty as well. And then Yorkshire CND has also initiated a faith leaders pledge as well. So as well as MPs and mayors and all that sort of thing signing up, they are working on faith leaders to sign up. So that's going very well, apparently. And then two other ways in which bringing local pressure to bear. One is through trade unions. If you're in a trade union branch or on a local trades council, get a motion passed by them. Similarly, if you're involved in a political party. So there are a number of parties in Parliament that do support the TPNW. You won't be surprised to know it's the Green Party, the SNP and Plaid Cymru. But Labour, Tories and Lib Dems do not have a position in support of the TPNW. So there's a lot of work to do there. But putting motions through local branches or putting them to party conferences to try and bring about a change in policy, that's one of the key things that we are keen on doing. And then finally, Chair, just to give you advance notice of something that we're going to be announcing fairly soon. You may know that the conference signatory states, or the states party to the treaty, they're going to have their first treaty conference later this year. I think it's going to be in Vienna in November, well, subject to pandemics or whatever. But countries that aren't signatories or aren't ratifiers may go along and observe or engage constructively with the states parties. And what we want to do is to push the UK to go along and participate, even to send a diplomat as an observer. This would be a great first step. And in actual fact, we have got a reasonable track record in this type of area, because in 2014, we had a campaign to get Britain to go to the humanitarian consequences conference in Vienna in 2014, and the government sent someone along, a diplomat along, to participate in that conference. So we had success then. So we feel that that's not a demand that is a kind of unfulfillable demand. It's something that they could do, not least because the treaty, states parties to the treaty will be talking about verification mechanisms and how that the treaty can do that. And Britain, as you may know, prides itself on being a great expert on verification processes, you know, so they could go along and contribute their expertise on verification of nuclear disarmament, for example. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. We'll be announcing that, I don't know, in a month or so, to give people time to build up to that. We'll produce cards which you can use to send to, probably to Boris Johnson, I guess, probably the person who makes the decisions there. But anyway, we'll have that kind of lobbying campaign to persuade the government to send someone to that first treaty conference. So that's it, really. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Where is that conference of the signatories? Where
I believe it's going to be in Vienna.
Okay. Well, thank you. Now, we promised Kate that we would let her escape to go and have her supper. So we'll keep it relatively efficient, let's say, in terms of the questions. Again, same format. Do either raise your hand or use the reactions knob if you do want to ask a question. Rob.
Hi, Kate. Thanks very much. Very interesting. I'm trying to think a bit sort of off the plot laterally on what things that people can do. And I just wonder whether CND have considered the fact that there is no civil defence in this country at all against nuclear attack for the civilian population. The government probably might have some plans for himself. I'm just minded that over 20 years ago, I was part of a team that set up local television in Oxford in a studio on the Woodstock Road, which was the Oxford County Council headquarters for nuclear war. The advantage to us was it was unused and had no windows. The disadvantage to the OCC was it was made of breeze block. And I knew very well that it would be no protection at all. And that was the start of actually really dismantling any civil defence. But if the government thinks that we are seriously under threat to the extent that we have to maintain CASD at sea 7 days a week, 365 days a year, why also aren't they doing something to protect the civilian population other than threaten to retaliate? Because if you retaliate, by definition, a lot of the population will have been harmed already. Is it worth raising this?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very, very good idea, actually. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. I think we should develop some work around that, certainly. I mean, it's an embarrassing question for them, isn't it? You know, and also it's
sort of negative marketing.
Yeah.
Well, it's also kind of strange love-like, isn't it? In the sense that you're kind of calling their bluff, but
yeah.
No, I brought to mind, because I've just watched Strangelove again. I've forgotten how horrific and how applicable it is today.
Yeah. No, it's an amazing film, really.
Pete, you've gone off mute. Did you want to ask a question? Oh.
I think that might have been no.
No, okay. Kate, just to answer your question about our council, we are very, very blue, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they would all be completely against the idea of Faringdon supporting the TPNW. But a tiny little anecdotal story. We have there's a justice and peace group that has on occasion tried to be slightly more ecumenical across the various churches, and on approaching the Anglican vicar on one occasion, so to have the Justice and Peace group completely ecumenical, he did say, and he was quite embarrassed about it afterwards, he laughed, but he genuinely said, well, as a church, we would have no problems with the justice part, but we would have a real problem with the peace part. And the reason why he said that is because half the congregation, and I'm not exaggerating, are directly linked in some way to the military, which would be Shrivenham next to us, or Fairford just to the north of us, or Welford just to the south of us. And that, therefore, there is this very, very strong, yes, of course, Harwell is loosely associated with the atomic research side of things. But he did actually, amazingly enough, raise this very important point that there's an emotional barrier almost to being able to countenance this, to be able to actually even consider it.
Yeah, that just reminds me of something I noticed on our website earlier on, which was the coverage of the Westminster Abbey event a couple of years ago, when there was the celebration of, was it 50 years of continuous at-sea deterrent, or some incredibly long period of time, and the huge row that erupted actually within the church about it, because the, I don't know, Dean of Westminster Abbey or whatever he was, was hosting this event, in celebration of nuclear weapons. And then there was an uproar amongst the clergy, who said this is completely inappropriate. We can't have this in a house of God, and the kind of huge argument going on. So, I mean, the positive side of that was we got huge coverage for the issue, as a result of their standing up in that way. So that was fantastic. And I've remembered that, Nigel, you also raised the question or the issue of the environment and climate campaigning as well, and linking that to the nuclear issue. And of course, I know that you've been involved with XR Peace. So we're continuing that relationship that we have with XR Peace. But of course, because of the pandemic restrictions, that's kind of changed the way in which people can campaign on it. But just in terms of other campaigning for the year ahead, hopefully, more things will be possible. Of course, we know that Britain is hosting COP26 in Scotland. I think that's also in November. And we've signed up to be part of the COP26 coalition, which is the civil society organisations protesting around it, but also having kind of alternative events and discussions and so on the issues. So we're going to be involved in that. I think one of the side events that we're participating in is one about defence diversification, which obviously is topical because of the way in which people who had been making nuclear weapons submarines during the first lockdown then were shifted onto making PPE and ventilators and so on, so around that. But also they're going to call for decentralised activities and actions around the time of COP. So instead of people going up to Scotland, if that's not possible or desirable, then to have local activities raising awareness of the whole climate and environment issues, and so for us, linking the two existential threats of nuclear war and climate crisis, is something that I know is a view that's very strongly held and supported by lots of our members and local groups. So no doubt there will be action around that time, later in the year and in the lead up to it.
Thank you. Peter, you had your hand raised, or was it answered? Yeah. You're still on mute. Yeah.
Thank you. I just wondered if I could share this thought with you. You know that the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima meltdown is coming up. And that seems to be an opportunity we will have to discuss nuclear issues very vocally. And with the growing understanding of the link between the military and civil nuclear power, and the complete inability to argue that civil nuclear power can be justified in terms of a strategy for climate change, I wonder if this 10th anniversary will be an opportunity to exploit that line of argument.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course, I know, Peter, you're from Salisbury CND, and you recently had a really excellent webinar on this very issue, on the question of the link, the sort of military stroke civilian power link. And we've got the two academics from Sussex University who speak so well, and fantastic research on it. So, you know, really thank you for the work that Salisbury's doing around this. And yes, it's absolutely incredibly important, and it strikes me how much of the rest of the world is changing its perspective on nuclear power, nuclear energy production, where simultaneously our own government, in the face of all the statistics and the facts and the information about not only the damage done by nuclear weapons, the cost of it and so on, but how the way in which renewables are so rapidly developing, and you know there are new ways of storing the energy produced by renewables now, and so on. You know that our government is kind of so insistent on sticking with nuclear power. I mean, it may be that they're not able to because companies are kind of falling over themselves to get out of nuclear power now. So I think they're in a bit of a fix. But Peter, as you say, with the kind of military imperative there, it looks like they will continue to try and find ways to cross-subsidise the military research side through continuing with the civil energy side. But feel that there should be no future in nuclear energy for all the reasons that we know, you know, and not least because of the renewables, you know, being able to provide the energy that we need.
Thank you. Anyone with their hand raised? Dave Heddy, and then Jenny.
Yeah, I was just going to add, Stuart, you quite rightly said that we're very blue around here, but don't forget that we do have a Lib Dem controlled district council and two Lib Dem councillors on that council from Faringdon. So there might be an opportunity there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Good
In
point.
fact, a number of Lib Dem MPs have signed the EDM 1072, including Weira Hobhouse from Bath, who has come good on the nuclear stuff, at least in part because of the work done by Bath CND group. You know, so I think the Lib Dems are reasonably susceptible, I believe.
Thank you. Jenny, you're on mute. That's it.
Okay now?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Sorry about that. Going back to, I think it was Stuart's point about our local council, Faringdon Council, being very blue because of the number of workers in the places like Shrivenham and so on around here. I think there's a link here between trying to convince people of that sort whose lives are sort of invested in nuclear with the trade unions. And it worries me that a number of trade unions are pro-Trident. And after all, in the long run, you know, when it comes to the point, it's the trade unionists who actually make these weapons, the ordinary working people. And I wondered, Kate, if you've got any sort of thoughts along those lines, how can we, I can't remember which trade of the large trade unions it is that is pro-Trident, you can probably tell me, and how we can sort of campaign along those lines.
Well, as you may know, the TUC has a position against trident replacement. But there are two major unions, that's Unite and the GMB, who are, well, let's say more ambivalent about it. I'm not quite sure if the GMB actually is pro-Trident as such, or whether it has a similar position to Unite, which is essentially that they would be against Trident replacement and nuclear weapons, or they are, but only when replacement jobs are guaranteed. So it's a kind of, they're opposed, but subject to the guarantee that alternative work will be made available, and equivalent work as well as alternative work. So that's the situation with that. In fact, Unite did a year or two ago produce a very extensive report about defence diversification. You know, so it's not something that it doesn't think of, but it's obviously something that they're in something of a bind over, because they have significant number of members in that sector, you know, so they don't want to have a policy which is, you know, just will get rid of your jobs irrespective kind of thing. They want to say that they will, well, they want to be campaigning for alternative work to be made available. And that's why we very strongly support the initiative for a defence diversification agency. And, you know, when Jeremy was leader of the Labour Party, we and the TUC and others campaigned very strongly that Labour in opposition should have a shadow defence diversification agency, so the workforce could be involved with this, you know, as well as the you know, the companies, and as well as government, you know, so the industry, the workforce and government discussing it together. But there's, you know, even then it didn't happen, you know, so that's the problem. You know, we need to have some kind of to make headway with those particular workforces. You need to have a government demonstrating the political will to give them alternative employment.
Actually, it's more hopeful than I had thought, so that's something.
Oh, good.
Thank you. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. Nigel.
I just wanted to ask you, Kate, about the situation where the nuclear warhead convoys continue to travel back and forward to Scotland from Fairfield during the COVID lockdowns. They have done that throughout last year, since May, and the first one this year was in January, whilst there's a national lockdown, and there's another one imminent. So this is whilst there's also outbreaks in Faslane of COVID, and they continue to drive their convoys up and down with the upgraded warheads. They're taking upgraded warheads. So I wondered about your comments on this. I presume they can just do what they like, but I wondered about, could you tell us something about that?
Well, I mean, Nigel, I'm sure you know much more about it than I do, you know, the details of it, but absolutely, it's disgraceful. And I'm just wondering, actually, you've made me think that we should be putting down some parliamentary questions on this, you know, because it's bad enough in normal times, you know, but if you had that kind of accident or catastrophe, you know, in pandemic circumstances, you know, and the just the additional risk that is being posed to the NHS and the emergency services, you know, should rule it out. So I'm wondering if maybe we could be in touch about drafting some parliamentary questions to put down about this.
That would be lovely.
Thank you.
Peter.
Just in the context where we were talking about trade union ambivalence at best over Trident, I was at another webinar the other day and saw a very interesting figure that suggested that work on renewable energy generated 5 times the number of jobs that the same expenditure generated on defence industry work, which I thought was something we perhaps ought to build on a bit.
No, that's absolutely correct. And we've commissioned economic studies in the past, which compared how many jobs, the money you spend on, effectively producing like 11,000 jobs in the nuclear weapons sector, how many jobs could be produced by the same amount of money in other sectors, and it's kind of many, many times more jobs, for that amount of money. But, sometimes you feel you say these figures until you're blue in the face, and people just don't want to hear it. That's the problem. But I mean, the good news, always wanting to say some good news, the Nuclear Education Trust, which you may know is the kind of charitable educational arm linked to CND, which funds research. It recently funded research in relation to Scottish jobs, and in the nuclear weapons sector, and which involved having interviews with people in the workforce there, and a very diverse range of contributors to that. And that was actually done in collaboration with the Scottish TUC, and was launched on a webinar a couple of weeks ago. So that's a very interesting new report. And of course, 2 or 3 years ago now, I think it was, the Nuclear Education Trust produced funded the production of a further piece of research about, it's called International Learning on Defence Diversification. There's some really interesting studies about how that has taken place in different countries, including in the United States. I mean, they've had an incredible defence diversification program there, not particularly around nuclear weapons, but around communities associated with other forms of military production, or to do with the closure of military bases. I mean, it can be done. And sometimes, government treat us as though we're utopian idiots for even suggesting such a thing. But there's so much evidence and experience. I mean, places like Germany, for example, these things happen and get done. So if anyone wants, to look at those, go to the Nuclear Education Trust website. It's really fascinating, the amount of research and work that's been done in this area. It's really solid stuff.
Thank you. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
No, I was just thinking back to Rob's talk last month, and as far as I understand it, the reason for him starting his research was because he felt that the expense of nuclear weapons was sucking the heart out of the Navy. So at the centre of his concern was conventional naval forces. And I just wondered if CND had any route through to military powers, aside from government, to sort of lobby them to say, look, can't you see what the expense of nuclear weapons is doing to your conventional forces? I mean, do you have any idea of how much sympathy there is at the top of the military?
Well, I think quite a bit, and I've heard anecdotally. Usually we only hear about it when they've retired, but you're probably aware that over the past few years, some really senior military figures, like retired generals and field marshals and so on, now peers in the House of Lords, have periodically made statements or written to the Times, making exactly the point that Rob is making. The opportunity cost of having nuclear weapons is not having necessary military equipment, and good treatment for the service personnel, and all the kinds of things that one may need to deal with conventional threats, or, for those people who are not very keen on war, the peacekeeping and emergency functions of the armed forces, which there are many uses. So yes, there's certainly that kind of feeling there, but of course, while people are still employed in the armed forces, they're not really at liberty to make those points. But one is aware that that kind of sentiment is certainly there. And when you look at the MOD budget, and particularly the MOD equipment budget and all the different calls upon it, then you can understand why those kinds of discussions take place.
Rob, did you want to chip in?
Yes, it's an interesting one, because I talk, as Kate knows, and I've said, I talk quite a lot within the Navy to my peers. I can't talk to people serving, because that would be, undermining the problem that people have of actually serving. But I do write articles which are read by serving people I know. But I think there is a great fear within the Navy. There are a lot of people who think too much money is being spent on Trident and not enough on conventional warfare. But there is this great fear that if they lose Trident, they get nothing. And actually, it's back to the old power things. Power depends on what you have. And having Trident actually gives a rationale, a purpose, and a whole sort of forward-looking motion to the Navy, which they might lose if they lost Trident, and lots of stuff comes around it which they benefit from. So what they have to do is get a substitute. Their fear is take Trident away and they won't get a substitute. They won't get more submarines, they won't get more ships. Possibly they're frightened the Air Force will get it all. And you mustn't underrate inter-service rivalry here as well. So there is a fear for the existence of the Navy, and Trident is critical for it. It's very, very seminal to them. It's difficult, but I have been impressed by the number of people who quietly, once they know some of the facts they didn't know before, are beginning to say, yeah, well, Rob, you got a point. Well spoken, keep talking, put your head over the parapet. Yeah, we don't want to put ours up, but you stick your head up, would you? But slowly I sense there is an increasing unhappiness. And I think one has to keep on pressing. And there are other people, not just myself. I think Kate may have heard of Admiral Jeremy Blackham, very respected man, and he has been arguing strongly for what he calls the twin pillars. There is absolutely no point in having a nuclear weapons system if you don't have a strong conventional force, because if it's not a strong conventional force, you only have nuclear weapons. But he's now convinced himself we shouldn't have nuclear weapons anyway. So there are voices, but cost. I think people are more amenable to the cost element than they are to the moral argument.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very, very useful. Thank you. Chair, I'm going to...
Yes, 9 o'clock. Yes, absolutely. Well, we promised Kate that we'd let her escape at 9 o'clock. So we've finished with the tag team of Kate and Rob together. So and it's been a wonderfully thoughtful and informative discussion, as usual, Kate. So we're really incredibly grateful that you've given us of your time and of your wisdom, really, that's built up over many years. So thank you very much indeed, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you. Love to see you all and hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Right. And enjoy your supper.
Thank you.
Bye,
all right.
everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Before you go.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
I'm just going to stop the recording, by the way. So unless this has got something to do with the same subject.
No.
No? Okay, recording is stopping.